All right, everyone. Let's get started. So the first thing you're probably wondering is what's going to be on this exam next week. Remember, the exam got moved from this week to next week. It'll be open on Monday and Tuesday, so you have some flexibility in terms of when you want to take it. It will be open for an hour. There will be about 40 questions, multiple choice. The study guide will actually be posted later today, so you'll have that. Primarily going over some of the main concepts and definitions of concepts that we've talked about and that have shown up in the readings. Essentially, everything that is on the study guide. Well, let me turn that around. Everything that's on the exam will be on the study guide, but not necessarily everything on the study guide will make it onto the exam. So it will cover the first three chapters of the States and Power book, as well as my lectures, which generally coincide fairly well. I will be available on Friday, which is tomorrow, at various points during the day. So if you're interested in talking to me or anything, please feel free to email me, and I will respond as quickly as I can. So last time the first chapter and the first lectures talked about the pre-state world, the ancient world, as we sometimes call it, the ancient Roman Empire, the ancient empires and dynasties in China, and then moving to the feudal systems that emerged after the collapse of Rome, the feudal system that we saw in Japan, the difference in the way that bureaucracy developed both in the West as well as in China, originating much earlier in China. And that's what we're all sort of building closer and closer to the actual development of the nation state, which is what we'll be talking about today, and then even, kind of getting to that even more next week and as we get into chapter 4. I do want to again just say I've enjoyed reading your packback discussions. It's kind of like I don't know if it's like the highlight of my day, but it's one of the highlights of my day. You're asking very good questions. You have very thoughtful responses. Just keep up the good work there. So it's very appropriate today. One of the things that we'll be talking about is the development of nations, what they do, what they're comprised of, and so on. One of the major factors of a government, of a state, is taxes, being able to tax its people to pay for various services. And it happens to be April 15th today, which is normally the tax deadline. I'm not sure if it's actually been extended this year. Last year was extended due to the pandemic, but normally, April 15th is basically you want to have your taxes in, or else you get in some amount of trouble. So taxation, we'll be talking about taxes today. Because it turns out to be extremely important for the history of the development of the state. So states, as Lockman says, they do two things. They tax people and they enlist soldiers to protect the territory. So we'll primarily be looking at elites and the sort of decision-making that elites had as sort of an overview of history. So anyway. Money is now beginning to enter it in a much more pervasive way than we saw before the development of the state. As we move away from feudalism and sort of peasant serfdom, serfs, and that type of society, we see a more bureaucratic apparatus develop to more adequately assess what was going on in the country. So elites still had control over government budgets, and much of it went to what we call venal offices. And so these are generally corrupt offices that have been created, for aristocrats. So you saw this happening in France, especially as the old regime started to break down and, started to modernize. what happened was that a lot of the aristocrats excuse me, were then given these venal offices, and these are just, they gave them to them just as something that gave them more power and prestige. But along with every venal office then came the need for funding for those offices, and that required more taxation or other types of corruption. So it was a very inefficient system. There were two main problems that you saw in elites in early sort of nations. One was increasing their overall taxes, making sure that they received more money, that their budgets were growing, that they could, raise armies and do whatever else they needed to do. And the other thing was that the central government had to make sure that the tax collectors were actually bringing everything in and weren't kind of, squirreling it, some of it away for themselves, which was harder to do in a non-bureaucratic society. It actually was fairly early on, before a lot of these bureaucratic systems were developed, that the Normans who invaded England from France, they carried out the Domesday Survey in 1086, about 20 years after the invasion of England. And so this was to basically find out, what the state of the countryside was, how much livestock was in the country, what types of agriculture, who owned the land, what were the systems of feudalism, that sort of thing. The survey then became kind of codified in law for several centuries, and it was still used by kings, even though the actual objective conditions had transformed quite dramatically. So how did rulers manage to find and tax revenue of their own and move beyond these aristocrats who held all this land and who may not be willing to give up their tax collections and so on? So over time, as we kind of talked about, towns become more important. And pretty soon, as trade just starts to flourish, as you get farther away from the collapse of Rome and you get closer to the European Renaissance, and you're getting more stuff coming from Asia, silk and spices especially. We'll talk about those, and I believe quite a bit in the next week's lecture. So towns become the sources of revenue for the royalty of these new sort of countries that are developing. So actually, though, again, it's even within towns, it's not necessarily like, individuals are getting taxed or there's a sales tax and stuff like that. There's still not an efficient, really modern way of taxing people, or at least of gaining revenue. So the main way that most of the world used taxes were through tariffs. So tariffs would be, and we still see these today. So basically, you're, say, a cloth maker in Britain wants to break into the U.S. market. American-made cloth goes for about $4 a roll. The British-made one costs about $4 a roll. So roughly the same, but maybe either it's a different color or something like that. And so, but the United States, in order to, kind of protect their own cloth industry, while at the same time allowing for some competition, adds a 25% tariff. So yeah, you can, sell your cloth in the United States, but you're going to have to, pay this tariff, which means then that oftentimes it's pushed onto the consumer. So the British cloth will be now on, in stores or whatever, but it will just be, cost $1 more. And, if it does well, then it might actually outdo the American cloth business. So that's basically, for many centuries, how most countries were raising money. Before it was easy to actually assess individual incomes and sales tax and things like that. It was primarily tariffs. And tariffs have been in the news over the last few years. The Trump administration instituted a series of tariffs on countries really around the world, but particularly on China. And so this also ended up hurting the United States, at least a number of aluminum and steel businesses, or businesses that relied upon aluminum and steel, because they saw that their equipment costs were jumping by about 10 to 20%, and that's basically the impact of the tariffs. And it's unclear what impact the tariffs had. Coronavirus came along, and it's basically changed, kind of shook everything up. And I'm not sure what the Biden administration, I know that they've kept some tariffs, but I believe that they're removing others. So anyway, a very fluid, moving situation itself. Other ways that states gained money, aside from tariffs, what you often saw was tax farming. So this was basically where the state allowed some individuals, some private individuals called tax farmers, that they would go around and they would collect the tax from the people in exchange for a fee from the government, because the government was too busy enriching itself, or maybe building roads, or making armies, whatever it might be. It would be easier for maybe someone in the local region or something like that to go around and collect the taxes. This system was in use in Europe for a long time. It was widely used across the Ottoman Empire, beginning fairly early on, and then abolished finally in the 1900s. It was used in Iran for a long time, up until the 1900s, and the same with India. It was generally pretty inefficient. The reason being, again, that there was not a good way in which to monitor the tax farmers, and some of them were kind of getting away with kind of taxing too much, or not taxing some groups enough. There's a lot of cronyism and corruption. When are we going to get that out of government? But anyway, after a while, though, you start to see, after the French Revolution, for example, you start to see that the interests of the financial class and the landed aristocracy start to come together. And these new, they start to have positions within government, venal positions, non-venal positions, and so on. And you started to see new bureaucratic organizations replacing the monarchies. Though revolutions often, lead to conflict themselves. So after the French Revolution, you get Napoleon comes to sort of embody the revolution, and they tried to spread it through Europe, essentially leading to what we call the Napoleonic Wars. And in order to fight France and fight Napoleon, Britain becomes the first country in Europe, and probably the first modern or country to institute a sort of modern income tax to pay for the war. So before this, there had never been a tax on the wages, and so this was something new. And as you can see, it was not necessarily popular by the poor people. The poor people in Britain, who really, they didn't see any need to fight Napoleon, or what was going on in Europe was a long ways away, that sort of thing. We talked about Japan too last time, and how it changed from a feudal society to a more modern society with a modern form of bureaucratic administration. And it also, one of the things that it did, let me back up. One of the ways that it did this was to develop a uniform tax system. And this basically weakened the landlords quite a bit. You know, the former samurais and daimyo, maybe even people who are in the shogunate and so on. But it didn't actually affect the peasants. So you didn't see an uprising. You know, the landlords were not really able to, rally the peasants to fight back or anything like this. So it was kind of, Japan was able to sort of not have that kind of revolution that we saw in France and in some of the other European countries. The United States they imposed an income tax during the Civil War, as did the Confederacy and the South. Both did, to pay for the war. And in 1913, the United States made it permanent. And as you can see there, provision for tax on income is part of Constitution. So ever since then, we've had an income tax, and that has had various effects. What was also happening too during this whole time, these last couple of centuries, that as governments are, collecting money and rents and this sort of thing, leveling income taxes, you also start to see the development of national currencies. So at this time, silver and gold were still what economic value was tied to. So I'm just looking out my window. A couple of rabbits or monsters or something, who knows. Anyway, so at this time, gold and silver, they were still kind of, how the paper notes were valued, because it became really inefficient to try and carry around gold and silver all the time. So paper notes were developed as a way to represent wealth, represent the holdings in gold and silver, and that system changed in ways we'll discuss later. And in other things we'll discuss later, with the big kind of revolution in currency now are the cryptocurrencies. And maybe some of you are Bitcoin investors, or your friends are, or something like this. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail right now, but the basic technology is this sort of it's this blockchain technology, and it's now being used for things beyond cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. But the what's kind of fascinating about it is that everything is recorded. Every transaction is recorded and becomes part of the blockchain, and it's different than the way in which banks, in which credit card payments are made through banks and things like that. So anyway, we'll get into this a little bit more, not in great detail, but a little bit more when we get towards more recent times. Other things that were key to the development of the modern nation-state: bonds. These were loans by private individuals, often to companies or to governments. And these were basically loans, essentially loans used to governments, and then sometimes they go into the market, and that can be a good thing. Sometimes, though, they crash, as things do when they go into the market. So this happened several times in ancient China, and later on in Europe, as the system was adopted in the United States. So along with bonds, you saw, as I said, you had the development of the paper currency, and this also helped citizens feel connected to their nation. So, they would have, important symbols, places, leaders, that sort of thing, things that were symbolic of the country, the culture, that sort of thing. And this helped people feel more connected, not only to the economy, but to their culture, but to the nation state itself. And it was a way in which the nation state was seen to be more legitimate through people's eyes, as it was connected both to the economy, but also through these through this cultural symbolism. So the development of armies, which for the most part, were primarily men, but not uniformly or exclusively, but overwhelmingly. Armies in the early days were developed by were comprised of mostly men. So rulers, in order to, enlarge their armies, they could hire more mercenaries. We kind of talked about that a little bit last time, and we'll talk about it again. They could take more command over troops that were located in towns, such as police forces, or early police forces, I should say, kind of militias. Maybe some aristocrats have militias and so on, so the rulers could take over some of those troops, or they could try to convince their own subjects to join some sort of part-time militia to help fight off some other noble. Usually, oftentimes the people didn't early on. If you remember, the peasants didn't really have any sort of connection to what was going on with the monarchies, the dynasties, and those sorts of things. However, as the working class develops and farmers and so on become more connected to the nation state through things like paper money and so on, then they started to feel some sort of connection, and willing to fight and willing to kill and die for the nation. Now, the draft is kind of a fascinating thing. The first genuine draft where people were, required, conscripted to fight, was in the United States to fight in the Revolutionary War. This was the first time that a state was able to actually enlist armed men beyond what it could actually pay, and without appealing to local elites. So, it was kind of radical, and it actually worked. And other countries noticed, and Prussia instituted one to fight Napoleon. And really, by the end then of the 1800s, all countries had a draft, and so did Japan. And, not surprisingly, we saw some big wars later on. Now, if you're opposed to the draft, there's, I kind of want to walk you through this class by the Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel. He teaches this class and records it, and he'll ask his students, raise your hand if you're opposed to the draft. And this is Harvard, so it's pretty liberal, and the majority of hands go up. The vast majority don't think that the draft is right. They're opposed to it. Then he asks, do you think it's unfair that people who have less privilege overwhelmingly, comprise the armed forces? Most of the students raise their hands, basically the same students. Then he kind of, says, okay, how do you balance that? If it's unfair, if you think that it's unfair and exploitative and oppressive to have people in the lower income groups, racial minorities, and so on, fight in the armed forces, if you think that's wrong, what's the other solution? Because the military, the all-volunteer military in the United States, is not comprised of middle class or upper class people. It's predominantly, overwhelmingly people from the lower classes. So, then maybe a draft does sound more, at least more fair, because it's a draft, it's a lottery system. I don't know what the answer to the question is. There's the easy way. Well, maybe we could just be pacifists and not have war. Well, that would be ideal, but until we get to that point, maybe think about these questions. These are, I think it's a very, very kind of fascinating way to think about this. And the nature of war has changed quite dramatically, and primarily as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution revolutionized war as well. The First World War and the Second World War really demonstrated that. In fact, the First World War was so jarring to the psyche of Europe and North Africa and parts of Asia, the United States, and so on, that in our history, and it changed so many things, that in our history, the flu influenza of 1918, which we all are familiar with now. It kind of was sort of a backstory, even though it killed far more people than the World War and was much more widespread. It happened sort of as the war was going on and coming to an end. So it was during a time of already tremendous change. That's one reason that it's not so prominent in our history, because it's kind of tacked on to the end of the the First World War. Okay, so well, again, why is there patriotism though? I mean, even when you see the cultural icons on your money and so on, why do people still feel the need to feel patriotic toward their nation, their country? Where does this come from? Well, tribalism in one word. So in the last few years, there's been a lot of fascinating research in social psychology, really looking at political attitudes. And now sometimes it's called political psychology, political physiology. It's all kind of, I still kind of lump it under sociobiology, which is in sociology. But a number of researchers have looked at some of these things and kind of looking at the ways in which our minds work, how we are social animals, and we have our groups. So Joshua Green has done a lot of research on this. He's done the trolley experiment that you may be familiar with, where there's a trolley going down the track, and it's going there's a divergence in the track. It will kill 5 people. If it goes the other way, it will kill 1 person, and you have to decide which path to take. And so he's done research on that type of decision making while putting people through MRIs and stuff and so on. The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt, has developed a moral foundations theory, which we'll actually talk about a little bit later on in this class, that looks at people's moral attitudes and moral psychology and how you can kind of tie that to political attitudes. And then more directly, the work by Hibbing and some of his colleagues that looks very deeply in a lot of different ways at different political attitudes, and finds some interesting things in the biology and the psychology of political differences. But we'll get into that in a lot more detail later on. We'll actually be reading a couple things by Hibbing and some of his more recent research. Not necessarily on that topic, but anyway. So, okay, jumping back to monkeys, as I said, we got to go back a little bit in time to understand modern governments and conflict and so on. So when we think about humans and where we are in the world and in the actual planet, we're right in between the bonobo and the chimpanzee. So the chimpanzee is more well known. The bonobo is not as well known. They look very similar. It's hard to tell them apart. I personally can't really tell them apart if I'm shown pictures of them. But chimpanzees and bonobos, they act quite a bit differently, as you can see here. So bonobos are much more empathizing in the way that they think. A chimpanzee is more systematizing. In terms of this, the B is, bonobo, C is chimpanzee. So things like gaze following, sharing of food, cooperation, social play, that's all bonobos. They're like hippies of the 1960s, and they're a very sexual species. You probably know, if you know anything about bonobos, you probably know that. They're not monogamous. They're quite polygamous. They engage in all sorts of hetero and homosexual activity. They have sex to celebrate the end of a meal, to celebrate the end of having sex, and again and again. So it's like what the 1960s hippies at Woodstock, imagined for the future human society, is basically the bonobo. Chimpanzees, they, are more likely to use tools, causal reasoning, recognize one thing causes another, spatial memory, territory, that sort of thing. and aggression. So they're much more likely to be aggressive than the bonobo is. And so the human basically is right there in between the chimpanzee. We can do things like gaze following, where, we can share, we can cooperate. In fact, we are a very cooperative species. We can social play, but we can also be extremely aggressive, as that last couple slides showed. We can engage in causal reasoning to a much better degree than those chimpanzees. We can do, regression analysis and logistic regression analysis and so on. Spatial memory, we can have that, and we're good at thinking of spaces and so on. So anyway, just want to kind of take us back to the very basics of our species, that we're cooperative and compassionate, but we're also very aggressive and can create some very destructive machines. One of the earliest theorists, at least in Europe, on the modern state was Thomas Hobbes. He writes this book called Leviathan, and that basically refers to the state, this new state. And he's often portrayed as being like in favor of an authoritarian state, and he kind of was, but really what he was afraid of was a lot of war. And so he lived through the English Civil War, and it made him want there to be a powerful government that would be able to prevent a civil war or many civil wars. He says, hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition called ware, and such a ware as is of every man against every man. Ware is kind of like anarchy. It's basically, there's no central government. You've got just militias fighting each other. And we'll talk about current places in the world that would be in such a situation, or Hobbes would call them a ware. So Hobbes, as I said, was in favor of strong government, but because he wanted something to contain the aggressive impulses of people. He says government is necessary not because man is naturally bad, but because man is by nature more individualistic than social. That's arguable, that last phrase. But anyway, that was kind of his reasoning. Someone else who was kind of saying the same thing, but much earlier, like 1,000 years earlier or so, Yang Shang, or sometimes more popularly known as Lord Shang in China, was born during the Warring States period in China, which was sort of a condition like that ware that Hobbes was talking about. So he saw these different various warring factions in China and helped develop a system to prevent these conflicts. And his aim, like Hobbes, was to develop a rich, strong state that could provide order. And it's, that would be the greatest benefit to people, would be order. And he got his, a lot of his inspiration from Confucianism, and he helped develop the legalism of China, which was a powerful system of bureaucracy to manage the country, and it did it fairly successfully for quite some time. He kind of recognized that the state has to attend to the what the citizens or subjects desire. Doesn't necessarily mean they have to give in, but it has to try to provide for the citizenry. And he also said that leaders received this mandate from heaven that allowed them to have a powerful government. And he said, humans are born having desires. When they have desires but do not get the objects of their desires, then they cannot but seek some means of satisfaction. If there is no measure or limit to their seeking, then they cannot help but struggle with one another. And then there will be chaos and everyone will be impoverished. So that was essentially, one of the reasons for the development of the state. And we'll talk about it a little bit more next time. But in Europe you had what's called the Treaty of Westphalia develop or be signed after about 30 years. That was the 30 Years War in Europe, and it was fought across the continent, and it was very bloody. And you get the Treaty of Westphalia that kind of laid out some of the national boundaries that are still there today for the most part, like France and Spain, Great Britain, and so on. So we saw then that war has actually been declining over time. So Steven Pinker wrote this famous, somewhat controversial book called "The Better Angels of Our Nature" from an Abraham Lincoln speech. And he points out that, at least during the last century, war has dramatically declined, especially between two states. So between two countries like Germany and France, for example, or Pakistan and India, something like that. There's been a decline in those types of conflict. The colonial conflicts have come to an end by the 1970s. Every country had been decolonized in the more literal sense. You saw more civil wars happen, and civil wars maybe with some foreign intervention, and that became most of the conflict during the 1980s. So you have to remember a lot of countries are becoming decolonized from European rule in the 1960s and 1970s, and then you see a lot of civil wars happen during that time period as different factions within these newly developed states are fighting for power. And you saw basically conditions of war in many, many places across the world, and led to some very bloody conflicts into the 1990s. And really by the 2000s, a lot of these conflicts had ended or had been reduced quite dramatically. Now, again, Pinker has argued that this is almost some sort of linear progression, and a lot of people, myself included, don't necessarily agree with that. I hope this is a linear progression and that it continues, but all it takes is one, another war, and we could see we could see interstate wars and civil wars increase dramatically. Again, I'm hoping that Pinker's thesis holds true. One of the top theorists and analysts of how nations came to be was a guy named Benedict Anderson, and he became famous for this book he wrote called Imagined Communities, where he looked at how nations developed over time. And he saw that myth making was an important part of it, that the development of some sort of story and narrative for a nation was necessary for people to think of themselves as citizens of this nation, to think of themselves as American, Russian, or whatever it might be. Excuse me. So Benedict Anderson, in his analysis, he saw that commercial printers were very important. And he saw that, once printing started, and especially after the Industrial Revolution, then you really start to see the development of the modern nation state. How, people... Again, remember we talked about in medieval times, people talked in a different language from just a village over, or in a very different dialect, and so on. How did it happen that people began to speak the same language? And their printers played a huge role. Publishers often used the language that was spoken by the elites, by the local elites or the national elites, or whoever it might be. And so they would print things like that in that language, and then it would really be up to the population to learn that language and either through schooling or on their own. But that's essentially how a lot of this happened. And so you start to get the development down here of people who, identify with various nations. And these were kind of the major nations at the time, some of them not so powerful, not as powerful anymore, such as Montenegro or Belgium, Serbia. And then today, of course, we have a much more multinational world, while we still at the same time have a system of nation states. How do places gain their legitimacy? Why, for example, was the Japanese system seen as legitimate, and why do you not see that, for example, in a number of nation states in Africa? Eric Hobsbawm, a famous Marxist historian, basically said that one reason for a country, a government, to have legitimacy is longevity. So Japan, its feudal time period, which kind of developed it into its modern period, lasted from the 11th century to the 19th century. And, there's a history then of people bonding together in times of war and conflict, and that sort of thing. And then you can look at the timeline of Japan if you'd like as well. Other ways that governments were able to present themselves as being legitimate was by currying favor with their subjects, by protecting the churches or religious organizations. So Russian czars and a lot of post-Soviet Russian rulers have protected the Orthodox Church. During the communist era of Soviet Russia, the church was made illegal, and it was, religion was made illegal, and that has actually been roaring back, and it's become to a point where Russia now is rather conservative in terms of its relationship with the church. And in India, we see the rise of the BJP, the militant wing of the militant party, militant Hindu party in India that is very popular. The current Prime Minister or President Narendra Modi comes from the BJP, and so they're part of this. What we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years in many countries, which we'll talk about, these more sort of rigid right-wing governments that have been elected or have come to power in recent years. But anyway, we'll get there. One sociologist who has spent a lot of time studying nation states and the development of the nation is a guy named Rogers Brubaker, and it is Rogers, not Roger. And he gives these two different models. One is the French model, but it's basically the U.S. model, where basically it's open to those who are willing to basically acquire the linguistic, the language and the culture. But, you're free to, live for the most part your own way, as long as you follow certain laws and guidelines and practices, certain social mores and so on. The other is the German model, where it's much more rigid, and you basically have to learn German, and you have to, people in Germany want immigrants to drop their former identity and kind of develop a more encompassing German identity. So those are two ways in which we see nations develop. Language is interesting. Back in during the Second World War, or I should say beforehand, Hitler excuse me. Hitler and the Nazi Party believed that one of their first goals should try to bring in all German people into Germany, and so that's one reason they invaded Austria early on, which was a German speaking country, and they invaded the German speaking parts of what's now the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Poland. Interestingly, Putin in Russia, Vladimir Putin, has given the same logic, the same reason for the invasion of Crimea, and has recently kind of reiterated the idea that Russia will be willing to send in forces to prevent or to protect Russian speaking communities. There are some analysts who said, "Oh, that's a very different way of doing things. What would the world look like if every country used that policy?" Well, Brazil would go back to Portugal. Most of South America, Mexico would go back to Spain. The United States, well, the eastern part of it would go back to Britain. Maybe all of it would go back to Britain. Some of it would go back to France, I guess. Or, well, no, not because now I'm just getting myself confused. Yeah, in other words, it's not a very sensible system. But that's the argument that Putin and the Russian government has made. And if you've been paying attention to the news, you know that there's been a major buildup of Russian military forces on the border with Ukraine. It's not clear what's going to happen, if there's going to be an invasion of Ukraine, or if this is just, sending a message to the new American administration, which is not as favorable to Russia as the last administration was. So it's unclear, as I said, what exactly is happening. Biden and Putin famously do not get along, and they do not like each other. So, as I said, it's unclear what's going to happen. But Russia does have tremendous influence, and it's where you see a lot of its influence is in Eastern Europe, where a lot of countries are basically they are completely dependent upon Russian natural gas and natural gas pipelines, as you can see them webbed out across Europe. Even Germany and Italy, France, to some extent, are dependent on cheap Russian natural gas. Not so much for Denmark, Spain, Britain, and so on. But anyway, that's one reason why Europe is somewhat limited in what it can do to respond to certain aggressive postures by Russia. So Michael Mann, the famous scholar on the nation state in sociology, has pointed out that a lot of authoritarian governments, they govern by divide and rule strategies where they pit one ethnic group against another. And I did my master's thesis on the conflict in Darfur in 2003, which actually encompassed much more than Sudan. It, was going on in Chad and to a lesser extent the Central African Republic. But the government in Khartoum was pitting the nomadic tribes, these nomadic northern camel herding tribes that claimed Arab descent, against these farming groups that didn't claim Arabic descent. These groups were all Islamic, but the nomadic tribes claimed Arab ancestry, whereas the farming, the Fur, as they were called, didn't. So these tribes, interestingly, they got along relatively well. Up until like the 1970s and 1980s, when a drought happened, and then you had a number of civil wars happen because of the former dictator of Libya named Gaddafi had basically sowed a lot of chaos across Africa and armed a lot of these militias, and then they were sort of then put to use by the Sudanese government later on. And they would go through and attack these villages. They would start by bombing them. Then the soldiers would come through. And if these villages, sometimes the men would be gone because they would be as part of the rebel army. So there were campaigns of mass rape against the women. And that's actually what my first paper in graduate school was on. I started my graduate career by going through hundreds of testimonies of women who had been raped in Darfur. And so we see this happen oftentimes with ethnic conflict and with all war, basically. Mass rape tends to accompany war. So anyway, that's one very tragic, terrible aspect of war. And I've heard interesting things about, arguments in favor of having robots fight wars. You could program robots not to sexually assault women and things like that. Anyway, food for thought, I guess. So, as I said, Benedict Anderson, he realizes these imagined communities come together through the printing press, through the unity of a common printed language. And so it was basically, if you remember, we had talked about institutional isomorphism, this idea that countries develop their governments by kind of copying other countries. And a female researcher, Pascal Casanova, basically did some very deep research into this and really found that that's not actually what happens. She looked at what people wrote about in different places, and she found that basically after people had translated the Bible, they quickly began writing their own ideas, their own stories, their own interpretations, and so on. And she found that certain authors began to shape national identity. Shakespeare for Spain, not for Spain, for the United Kingdom, for England, and so on. Cervantes for Spain, Don Quixote. Herder, Goethe, other writers for Germany, and so on. And she also pointed out that, these writers were generally not coming out of the aristocratic class, but a lot of them were coming out of poverty or war or other trying conditions. So she looked at and found that these ideas about nationality were not just countries copying governmental institutions and rule books and so on, but rather countries that were developing their own national identities based upon where they were, oftentimes the natural environment around them. For example, the famous writer George Orwell had one of his famous writings is called Politics in the English Language, and he talks about how the English language informs politics and what it means for politics and so on. And he also basically says, language can be used to oppress people. He wrote 1984, where there's this all-powerful big brother who monitors everyone. He also wrote the book Animal Farm, which has been made a movie, that is essentially about the communist revolution in Russia, where in Animal Farm the pigs take over, they're kind of like the Russian communists, and then they overwork all the other animals, and pretty soon they start to live like the humans did. And he was kind of talking about what the Soviet Union was doing to Ukraine at the time by overworking them, and we'll talk about that more later on. So after the Second World War happens, you start to see, other attempts at the development of the nation state. One interesting sort of state-sponsored approach was what was called Soviet realism. So painters were basically commissioned or made by the government to develop these this is realism in art, and it was meant to glorify the peasant way of life and leaders like Stalin and the good Russian kids, and later on the astronauts or cosmonauts and so on. So you had a number of things like that were trying to portray life as it was in the Soviet Union. But you also had this forward-looking vision of what the future could be, and this really started to gather pace after the Second World War, as it became clear that Russian agriculture had to be completely mechanized and changed. in order for it to be viable. And you start to see space exploration here, and then you start to see a lot of fascinating Soviet art. If you're interested in some of this stuff, I find it interesting aesthetically, but also just kind of historically. But you can go into like Google Images and Russian futurism, and you have all sorts of fascinating art that was developed kind of like American science fiction, flying cars, and so on and so forth. But this in a more collectivist communist setting. So there are other things that come to embody nations. So, for example, French cuisine. So the world knows cordon bleu because of the way in which the French government essentially sponsored French cuisine and made it a part of the development of the nation state, and so it's still considered very much a very national. There are a lot of national dishes that are unique to France, and it holds true for a number of other countries. But France, they kind of developed a specific cuisine while they were developing their own nation state. United States, I'm not sure if we have quite the same cuisine, as France, but one thing that the United States has that has now taken off in other parts of the world are national parks, a system of parks, city parks too, but parks that were made to save, preserve different scenic areas or rare areas where there's rare wildlife and so on. And so you have Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir here standing in Yosemite. Anyway, so that's one thing that's sort of unique for the United States. And then the other thing that we'll talk about, and your book talks about, and we'll kind of go into this in more detail later, is immigration and migration. So people have been moving around the globe throughout world history and American history. I'm teaching a class on immigration right now, and America is very interesting in the sense that it really is one of the first truly multicultural democracies, or at least the oldest. It's the oldest multicultural democracy. And it is a society that has, been founded on immigrants, at least after the near extermination of the indigenous people, immigrants from Europe and then later from Latin America and Asia. So the United States is unique in its acceptance of immigrants, even when it's limiting them, it still tends to be more accepting than many other places. If you look at sort of the polar opposite, would be like Japan, where it's very, very very difficult to move to Japan. There are a number of foreign workers who have come to Japan now. Then that has doubled since 2013. Why is that happening? Well, Japan's population, like the population in most European countries, is aging. And the young population, there's not enough young people in the younger ages to pay the social security system or pay into the social security systems. And you see that happening in European countries and potentially the United States as well. And this will be something that countries will have to think about, because we know that people are moving around the world. This is kind of an interesting view of the Syrian migration to Germany. Germany famously allowed, I believe, around 800,000 to 1 million refugees from Syria. But they had to go through much of Eastern Europe in order to get there, which meant crossing many other countries and other jurisdictions. One economist who has studied this in great detail is a guy named Paul Collier at Oxford. If you're interested in refugee policy, I would highly recommend checking out his work. Okay, so that is the end of the lecture. Again, like I said, the PowerPoints will be uploaded. The study guide will be uploaded later today, and it will primarily be terms that you'll want to know. The exam will be open on Monday and Tuesday, so you can decide when you want to take it, and there will be 40 questions. And I think that's all. If you have any burning questions, or if you have any questions after looking at the study guide, just send me an email. All right. Well, good luck, everyone, on the exam. I'll be posting the next lecture on Chapter 4 and moving on Tuesday. All right. Have a good week, everyone.